Abjuration, Conjuration, Divination, Enchantment, Evocation, Illusion, Necromancy, and Transmutation. These 8 schools of magic have existed in Dungeons & Dragons for a very long time, but today, in 5th edition, they seem mostly like a relic of the past that don't serve much of a purpose, except for providing some fairly arbitrary distinctions between spells. I've dabbled in previous editions, but the relevance and usefulness of spell schools is always something that I've wanted to get a deeper look at, which is exactly what we're going to do today. We are going to go through every edition of D&D from the original to today to see how it all started, what it became, and why we still have spell schools today. Original D&D was released back in 1974, and while it did contain 2 classes that could cast spells, the Cleric and the Magic User, and included many of the spells that we still know and love today like Charm Person, Fireball, and Fly, there was absolutely zero concept of spell schools, nothing that even vaguely resembled them. Spells from the original D&D mostly just consisted of the spell title and then a short, fairly cryptic paragraph that almost never actually provided enough detail to understand fully how a spell works. A lot more was left to the interpretation of the referee at the time, which is what would eventually become the DM. Really quickly, before we get to AD&D, I am getting so close to 20,000 subscribers. I'm currently less than 400 away. So if you'd like to help support the channel, subscribing and clicking the like button while you're there goes such a long way to supporting all the work here. Thank you so much. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition marks the first time that we see spell schools pop up in the game, though they still weren't actually called spell schools. And they didn't really do anything. Despite being the game that introduced the categorization of spells, it was a concept still left largely unexplored. Though a few of the names have slightly shifted, the original 8 strongly resembled what we have today in 5th edition. The school that we now know as Transmutation was called Alteration, and Enchantment was Enchantment Charm, Conjuration was Conjuration Summoning, and Evocation was Invocation Evocation. Otherwise, these classifications had zero mechanical impact on the game. Every spell was classified within 1 or even 2 schools of magic, but that classification had basically no relevance during play. It is worth noting that in AD&D, we also saw the Magic User get the Illusionist subclass, which is paving the way for what would eventually become specializations, and the thing that would make the use of spell schools. The thing is though, that the Illusionist was a bit of a strange subclass. In most respects, they were actually just outright worse than the main Magic User, and this isn't just me sharing an opinion. The text in the book explicitly states that in most ways, Illusionists are the same or worse than just being a base Magic User. Though it mentions that they get some powerful higher level spells, which they feel balances the playing field overall. It is worth noting that Illusionists were capped at level 7 spells, whereas basic magic users could go all the way up to level 9 spells. The Illusionist is more or less the only connection to the schools of magic that we have in the entire text. Ultimately, what we can see from AD&D is that they were just planting the seeds. They created the various schools and tagged each spell with one and dabbled in the system slightly with the Illusionist, but never did anything significant with it. That, however, massively changed with 2nd edition. AD&D's 2nd edition retained all of the same 8 schools of magic, though Divination was renamed to Greater Divination, which obviously paves the way for a 9th school of magic, Lesser Divination, which we will get to a bit shortly. 2nd edition was the first time that we got to see the term Wizard for the class instead of Magic User, which they had been using up until this point. They also continued with the trend of subclasses, and broadly speaking, the Wizard had 2. The Mage and the Specialist. The Mage, as implied by the existence of the Specialist subclass, was more of a generalist. They had no limitations in the spells that they could cast, and therefore could pick from a wider variety of spells as compared to a Specialist. The only downside is really that there was no upside. They were essentially just a generic spellcaster that could cast everything reasonably well. The opposite side of that coin was the Specialist. Now, I know I said that there were 2 subclasses, but technically there were 9. The Mage, and then 1 for each of the other 8 schools of magic. It's the 8 and not 9 schools, because you could not specialize in Lesser Divination. Instead, all wizards, regardless of being a Mage or Specialist, would be able to learn spells from the Lesser Divination school. Opting to specialize came with some very complicated realities. Firstly, depending on your character's race, you might not even be able to. Only humans, half-elves, and elves could specialize at all, with the one exception being illusion magic, which gnomes could also specialize in. Otherwise, it was really just humans, half-elves, and elves. Each specialization also had its own minimum ability score restrictions. For example, to be an abjurer, you needed a 15 in wisdom, an enchanter needed a 16 in charisma, an illusionist needed a 16 in dexterity, and a conjurer needed a 15 in constitution. These are just some of the requirements, but you get the picture. Probably the most significant sacrifice to make when opting to specialize in the School of Magic was the fact that it would bar you from being able to learn spells from certain other schools of magic. In order to know which schools you could not cast from, you would need to consult Table 22 on page 31 of the text, which would list each school, its requirements from race to ability scores, but also its opposition schools. Simply put, you could not learn any spells from your school's opposition school. For example, Adjurers could not learn spells from the Alteration or Illusion schools. Diviners could not learn spells from the Conjuration Summoning school, Necromancers could not learn spells from the Illusion or Enchantment schools, and most restrictively, Illusionists could not learn spells from any of the Necromancy, Evocation, or Abjuration schools of magic. So here's the thing, you're really getting locked out of quite a lot of spells, so there better be a great payoff for actually deciding to do that, and there mostly was. If you chose to specialize and give up access to potentially tons of spells, you did get some nice perks. Firstly, you would get one additional spell per spell level provided that the additional spell is from your specialized school. This is actually quite significant, as it meant that at first level you go from having just one spell to two. On top of that, you would also gain a +1 to any saving throw made to save against a spell from your specialized school, and enemies would have a -1 to their saving throws against your specialization spells to reflect your expertise in casting them. Additionally, specialists would also gain a +15% bonus applied to their percentile dice when attempting to learn spells from their school, but would similarly receive a -15% penalty applied to their attempts to learn spells from outside their specialty. And when they gain access to a new spell level, a specialist automatically gets to add one spell to their spellbook for free, requiring no roll. This is a tradition that is actually still carried forward into 5th edition. I'm not going to get very deeply into it at all, but I did also want to touch slightly on a somewhat parallel system that the priest classes had to manage, which were called spheres. Spells were also assigned to specific spheres, and when you decided to make a priest like a cleric, you had to choose which god you served, as they were responsible for providing you with your access to magic. Depending on the god that you chose to serve, the DM would be required to determine which sphere they influence, of which there are 16, ranging from things like animal and astral to plants, protection, healing, and elemental. Gods can be assigned a major and or minor spheres. You would gain access to all the spells from your god's major sphere provided you were of a level that could cast the spell, and if there was a minor sphere, you'd be able to learn spells up to level 3 from it. As you can probably tell, these schools of magic were a very important pillar of not just 2nd edition overall, but especially for wizards. The flexibility and potential power of your character could massively swing depending on whether or not you chose to specialize, and then swing even more depending on what the specialization was. The fact that you were locked out of certain schools altogether made choosing a specialization a very critical part of character creation. With 3rd edition, a lot of the same concepts that were born in 2nd edition were retained, but they were massively loosened up. For example, school specializations were no longer restricted to certain playable races by the character, and there were no ability score requirements tied to them either. In addition to that, while the concept of opposition schools persisted, the execution of it changed significantly. Whereas in 2nd edition, you would need to consult a table to determine which spells you could not learn spells from, in 3rd edition, you simply got to choose 2 schools of magic which you would be prohibited from learning spells from. These were, appropriately, called your prohibited schools. You could choose any 2 schools to prohibit, with the exception of divination. You were never allowed to prohibit divination. It is worth noting that the lesser/greater divination split no longer existed in 3rd edition as well. Interestingly though, if you picked divination to be your specialization school, rather than prohibiting 2 schools, you only needed to prohibit 1. This did make me wonder why exactly this was, and from what I can tell, the answer seems to be fairly straightforward. Essentially, divination was perceived as the weakest school. It's one of the smaller ones as far as spell quantity goes, and they were often kinda niche and had some wishy-washy effects that were not as consistent or reliable. So what likely would have happened if you were allowed to prohibit divination is that almost everyone would have just done that. So instead, they said that you weren't allowed to and gave a slight perk to someone choosing to specialize in the school with the benefit of only needing to drop one other school. So much like with 2nd edition, the question then becomes, what am I getting for specialization? The benefit was that you got to prepare one additional spell of your specialty school per day per spell level, and you got a +2 bonus to spellcraft checks to learn spells of your chosen school. This might not sound like a lot. It's certainly not as flashy as it was in 2e with a bonus and penalty to saving throws, but it still is quite powerful. especially as you level up, since those bonus spells accumulate pretty quickly. Interestingly, what this largely ended up with was divination being the best school to specialize in, since even if it was considered a generally weaker school, selecting a divination spell is still a pretty common thing to do, and if you specialized in divination, that spell is just considered to be free, and then you've only banned yourself from one school instead of two. One other note about spell schools in 3rd edition is that very technically, there is a 9th tier called Universal, but it's not really a true spell school at all. There were only a few spells that were tagged as universal instead of with an actual school of magic. This was done to ensure that every wizard, regardless of whether they opted to specialize or not, would be able to access these spells, which included things like Wish. The schools of magic in 3rd edition were still very central mechanics to the game, though probably less dramatic than they had been in 2nd edition, and they were still very important to the functioning of a wizard. I think the integration was a lot more elegant in this edition than it was in the past, which makes things easier and more natural to deal with. There were also a number of feats that existed in 3rd that could give you buffs to casting spells of a certain school, which also helps to further that seamless integration within the system. And then there's 4th edition, which, like a lot of things if you're familiar with 4e, you know that they essentially just stripped out just about everything that people know about D&D leading up until that point, including spell schools. This is not a commentary on 4th edition though. With hindsight, a lot of people have seemingly grown to appreciate the design, but for better or worse, it was incredibly different than its predecessors. One thing not spared in the design overhaul were spell schools, as they are essentially non-existent. The super oversimplified version is that essentially everything became a power in 4e, including spells, and every power had a keyword assigned to it with various effect types, and this is the only remnant of the old spell schools in the edition that you'll see. It had things like Charm, Conjuration, and Illusion. Polymorph was also one, which is essentially Transmutation. There were also other keywords like Poison and Sleep alongside a bunch of others. As far as the mechanical implementations go, it's pretty minimal. For the most part, the keywords on the effects were pure flavor, but that said, there were also some things that did interact with the system. For example, dwarves got a bonus to poison effects, and Eladrin got a bonus to charm effects. Conjurations would also have some specific rules tied to them, so these provided a bit of clarity about how to handle those kinds of situations. But essentially, that was it. There's not really anything else going on as far as schools of magic are concerned in 4th edition. And finally, there's 5th edition, which most people watching this video are probably quite familiar with. Spell schools have returned, but with much softer mechanical implications than what we've seen before. All of our same friends have returned that we saw in previous editions, but this time, they basically do nothing. There are a small subset of spells that will reference schools of magic like Detect Magic, which can be useful in identifying the potential harm or power that something might have if you haven't already figured it out, but for the most part, spell schools are pure flavor. The only way they really serve relevance is with the wizard subclasses, which are mostly based on the schools of magic. I'll focus on the 2024 update to 5th edition, since very little has changed as far as the relevance of the schools of magic goes. Each wizard subclass is based on one of the schools. So far in the new player's handbook, we have the Abjurer, Diviner, Evoker, and the Illusionist. Each of them gets to add spells of their respective schools for free to their spellbook, and whenever they gain access to a new level of spell, they can add another spell of their choice from their chosen school for free. On top of that, each subclass offers certain abilities that are based on casting spells of your chosen school, like Arcane Ward, which allows an Abjurer, whenever they cast an Abjuration spell with a spell slot, to create a protective shield around them, or Expert Divination, which allows a Diviner whenever they cast a Divination spell of level 2 or higher to regain an expended spell slot. Each of the wizard subclasses in 5th edition are built to embody the feeling and flavor of their connected school of magic, which is mostly what the entire subsystem is about in 5e. Flavor. The existence of the schools of magic are more about the way that the subclass express themselves than it is about any spell in particular or restrictions that exist because of the school that you chose. In 5e, it's less mechanical and more identity driven, which is a pretty dramatic difference from what we saw in earlier editions, particularly 2nd edition. So that's been a look at the schools of magic over the years. I actually think it's a pretty interesting system that I wish 5e did a little bit more with than it currently does. I do get that placing restrictions can be unfun in a lot of ways, and a large part of the design philosophy of 5e was to make every decision be fun, but I still think they could have done a little bit more with it. Anyway, let me know what you think about the schools of magic in the comments. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.